The lights of 1970s London shone brightly, but a dark shadow lurked behind the studio doors. For a young British actress, the path to stardom often required a private audition where acting was not the priority. While some accepted the indecent proposals of powerful directors, others refused to compromise. These brave women did not just lose roles, they were systematically erased from the industry. Today, we expose the names of 10 stars who vanished because they said no. Who were they, and who destroyed them? Press the like button, subscribe, and let us reveal the truth. Carol White. The story of Carol White is perhaps one of the most heartbreaking tales in the history of British cinema. Often hailed as the United Kingdom's answer to Brigitte Bardot, she possessed a raw, undeniable talent that captured the hearts of the working class. Her rise to fame was meteoric. In the year 1966, she starred in the television play Cathy Come Home. It was a role that shocked the nation, highlighting the issue of homelessness with such realism that it actually changed housing laws. Carol White was not just a pretty face, she was the voice of a generation. She followed this success with the film Poor Cow in the year 1967, cementing her status as a superstar of the kitchen sink realism genre. Critics adored her, audiences loved her, and Hollywood beckoned with open arms. It seemed that nothing could stop her ascent to the very top of the A-list, but the industry had other plans. However, the film business in the late 60s and early 70s was a predatory place for a young woman who looked like a blonde bombshell but wanted to be taken seriously as a dramatic artist. As she transitioned into the 1970s, the offers began to come with strings attached. Producers and directors saw her not as the gritty actress from Battersea, but as a commodity to be exploited. Carol White found herself constantly fighting against being typecast solely for her physical appearance. There were whispers in the corridors of power about her being difficult. In that era, the word difficult was often a code word used by rejected men to blacklist a woman who stood her ground. She refused to play the game of being the submissive starlet on the arms of the studio executives. She wanted roles that had substance, but the scripts that were sent her way were increasingly focused on exploiting her beauty rather than challenging her acting ability. By the early 1970s, the great roles had started to dry up significantly. It was not because her talent had evaporated, her performances remained electric when she was given the chance, it was because she refused to bow to the unwritten rules of the industry. She moved to Hollywood hoping for a fresh start, but she found the same culture, only on a larger and more ruthless scale. The pressure began to take a terrible toll on her well-being. Without the support system of a protective studio or a powerful mentor, which she might have had she accepted certain indecent proposals, she was left vulnerable. The press, often fed stories by the very men she had rejected, began to turn on her. They painted a picture of a chaotic woman, ignoring the systematic pressure she was facing behind the scenes. The tragedy of Carol White is that her career did not end with a bang, but with a slow, painful fade into obscurity. She was pushed to the margins of an industry she had helped to define. Instead of starring in the blockbusters of the mid-70s, she was relegated to smaller appearances and theater work that did not match her stature. The constant rejection and the psychological pressure from producers who told her she was the problem led her down a dark path of personal struggle. She sought solace in escapism, which only further damaged her reputation in a vicious cycle. The industry watched her struggle and did nothing to intervene, viewing her as a product that had served its purpose and could now be discarded. Looking back from the 21st century, it is clear that Carol White did not fail. She was failed by the system. She was a woman ahead of her time, demanding respect in an era that only wanted compliance. Her disappearance from the limelight was not a lack of ambition, but a direct result of an industry that punished women for asserting their boundaries. She passed away at the tender age of 48, a stark reminder of the human cost of the entertainment business. Her legacy remains in those early, powerful performances, a glimpse of the incredible career that should have been, had she been allowed to succeed on her own terms without compromising her dignity. Susan Penhaligon. If you lived in the United Kingdom during the middle of the 1970s, there was one face you absolutely could not escape. With her cascade of blonde curls and wide, expressive eyes, Susan Penhaligon was officially crowned the British Bardot. She was the definition of the IT girl, a title that every young actress dreams of but few can survive without scars. Her defining moment came in the year 1976 with the television drama Bouquet of Barbed Wire. It was a show that literally emptied the streets and pubs of Britain. Over 20 million people tuned in every week to watch the scandalous, twisted family drama unfold. Susan played Prue, the daughter at the center of an intense and controversial storyline involving her father. Overnight, she became the most desired woman in the country. The press was obsessed with her, photographers followed her every move, and Hollywood studios began to send their scripts across the Atlantic. It seemed written in the stars that she would become an international legend, standing alongside the likes of Helen Mirren or Julie Christie. However, the film industry of the 1970s had a very specific and very narrow plan for Susan Penhaligon. They did not see a classically trained actress capable of deep emotion, they saw a pin-up girl to be sold. The scripts that arrived on her doormat were repetitive and degrading. Every producer in London wanted to be the one to feature the British Bardot in a state of undress. When she expressed a desire to play serious roles, perhaps in Chekhov or Shakespeare, or gritty contemporary dramas that did not require nudity, the mood in the meeting rooms shifted instantly. The men in charge were not used to being told no by a 20-something starlet. They felt that because they had made her famous, they owned her image and her choices. Susan famously rejected the idea of moving to Hollywood permanently to play the game of the casting couch. She saw what it did to her peers, how the studio system chewed up young women and spat them out once their youth began to fade. Because she refused to simply smile and accept the roles of the decorative victim or the seductress, the industry began to cool towards her rapidly. The labels started to attach themselves to her name like a curse. She was whispered about as being difficult or ungrateful. It is a classic tactic of the entertainment machinery. If a woman has boundaries, she is a problem. The big film roles that should have followed the success of 1976 began to go to other actresses who were perhaps more willing to compromise their standards. Instead of starring in the major blockbusters of the late 70s and early 80s, Susan found herself working in theater and smaller television productions. While she never stopped working completely, the stratospheric career trajectory that was promised to her was cut short by the gatekeepers. The tragedy here is not a lack of talent, but a waste of potential orchestrated by a patriarchal system. Susan Penhaligon had the range to be one of the greats of cinema history. Yet, because she wanted to be valued for her mind and her acting ability rather than just her physical attributes, the doors to the highest level of stardom were quietly closed. She survived, which is a victory in itself, but one has to wonder what iconic performances we missed out on because the directors of the 1970s could not handle a woman who said no. She remains a symbol of integrity, a woman who chose her own dignity over the hollow promise of global fame, even if it meant stepping away from the spotlight that was rightfully hers. She proved that one could be a star without selling their soul, but the industry made sure she paid a heavy price for that independence. Linda Hayden. The story of Linda Hayden serves as a chilling reminder of how the British film industry in the late 1960s and 70s treated its very youngest stars. Linda was just 15 years old when she was cast in the film Baby Love in the year 1968. The movie was a controversial drama, often described by critics as the British answer to Lolita. Linda played a manipulative teenager who seduces an entire household, a role that required her to be presented as a fully grown object of desire despite her being legally a child. The marketing for the film was aggressive and uncomfortable, selling the image of this schoolgirl as a siren to a predominantly male audience. It catapulted her to immediate fame, but it also trapped her in a terrifying pigeonhole before she had even finished her education. For the next decade, Linda Hayden became the go-to face for a specific kind of role in British horror and exploitation cinema, a label she fought hard to escape. As she entered the 1970s, Linda became a staple of the Hammer horror films and other similar productions, such as Taste the Blood of Dracula and Blood on Satan's Claw. On screen, she was powerful and commanding, often playing the villainess or the temptress. But off the screen, she was navigating a minefield. The industry at that time was rife with predatory behavior. Directors and producers often viewed the young women in these horror films as interchangeable and available. The atmosphere on set in the 1970s was often loose and unprofessional by today's standards. Linda has spoken in later years about the resilience it required to navigate that world without losing oneself. She was constantly under pressure to perform scenes that pushed the boundaries of decency, and any hesitation was met with immense pressure from powerful men who held her contract in their hands. The turning point came when she tried to break away from the horror genre and the exploitation films to build a career as a serious dramatic actress. She wanted to show that she could act in comedies, thrillers, or period dramas that did not rely on her being the object of male fantasy. But the industry refused to let her grow up. To the casting directors and producers, she was frozen in time as the girl from Baby Love. When she refused to engage in the private dinners and the weekend parties where careers were often decided, the phone stopped ringing for the A-list roles. There is a brutal reality to the career of a scream queen in the 70s. As long as you were willing to scream and look frightened in flimsy costumes, you were employed. The moment you demanded respect as an adult artist, you became expendable to the machine. Linda Hayden's career in major mainstream cinema effectively stalled as the 1970s came to a close. The British film industry collapsed in many ways during the 1980s, but for actresses like Linda, the end came sooner. She had been used to sell tickets with her youth and beauty, and when she attempted to assert her boundaries, the machinery discarded her. She did not vanish because audiences stopped loving her. She vanished because the gatekeepers of the industry had no use for a woman they could not control. Instead of becoming a dame of the British theatre or a Hollywood star, she was left to find her own way. Her filmography stands as a testament to her survival instinct, a collection of cult classics where her talent shines through the often exploitative material she was given. She was a victim of typecasting in its most aggressive form, an actress who was never allowed to evolve because the industry preferred the fantasy over the real human being. Judy Geeson. When looking at the landscape of British cinema in the late 1960s, Judy Geeson was the face that represented the future. She burst onto the scene in the year 1967 with the iconic film To Sir, with Love, starring alongside the legendary Sidney Poitier. With her blonde hair, doe eyes, and a voice that could switch from sweet to rebellious in a second, she was the ultimate symbol of the swinging London teenager. She was not merely a decorative addition to the screen. She held her own against Hollywood titans, including John Wayne in Brannigan. Critics predicted that she would become the next Julie Christie or Vanessa Redgrave, a serious actress capable of carrying major dramatic films. By the time the 1970s arrived, the world was at her feet, and the British public adored her as the girl next door who had a hidden fire. However, the British film industry of the 1970s was rapidly changing, and not for the better. As the funding for quality dramas dried up, the studios turned towards cheaper, more sensational productions to keep the lights on. Judy, despite her proven acting chops in chilling true crime dramas like 10 Rillington Place, found herself being aggressively pushed into the horror and exploitation genre. The producers did not want Judy Geeson, the actress. They wanted Judy Geeson, the victim. They wanted to see her terrified, running through foggy moors in flimsy nightgowns or screaming in the face of some supernatural threat. The scripts she received became increasingly focused on her physical attributes rather than her dialogue. It was a golden cage. She was working constantly, but the artistic quality of the projects was in freefall, and the demands on her personal dignity were rising. Behind the scenes, the atmosphere was even more stifling. The casting directors and producers of that era operated with a sense of entitlement that would be shocking today. There was a pervasive expectation that young actresses should be grateful for any work and should express that gratitude in private settings. Judy was known for her professionalism and her desire to keep her private life out of the tabloids, a stance that did not sit well with the power players who thrived on gossip and control. When she refused to participate in the promotional circuits that required her to sell herself rather than the film, or when she turned down roles that were nothing more than gratuitous displays of flesh, the industry began to label her. She was seen as too serious, too unapproachable, or simply not fun enough for the lads club culture that dominated the Soho production offices. By the middle of the decade, Judy Geeson made a decision that many of her contemporaries were forced to consider. She packed her bags. Seeing that the British industry was determined to reduce her to a scream queen or a sex symbol, she looked towards America for salvation. It was a move born of necessity. The directors in London had stopped offering her the complex female-led narratives she deserved. They had pigeonholed her so effectively that she could not break out. While she found steady work in American television, appearing in shows like Poldark and eventually Gilmore Girls years later, her absence from the British big screen was a massive loss to the national cinema. She was effectively exiled by an industry that did not know what to do with a woman who wanted to be treated as a professional rather than a prop. Today, cinema historians look back at Judy Geeson's filmography with a mix of admiration and frustration. We see the flashes of brilliance in films that were often beneath her talent level. She is a prime example of how the 1970s machine ground down its brightest stars. Had she been given the roles that went to compliant favorites, or had the industry been a safer place for women to reject unwanted advances without fear of blacklisting, she might have been a dame of the British Empire today. Instead, she is remembered as a cult icon, a survivor of a brutal era who had to leave her home country just to maintain her self-respect and continue working in the profession she loved. Her story is a testament to the talent we lost because the system preferred compliance over capability. Alexandra Bastedo. If you were to ask any casting director in London during the late 1960s who the most beautiful woman in the world was, many would have pointed without hesitation to Alexandra Bastedo. With her striking features, platinum hair, and an elegance that seemed almost royal, she was the face of the hit science fiction espionage series, The Champions. But Alexandra was far more than just a pretty face to be plastered on the cover of magazines. She was incredibly intelligent, fluent in several European languages, including French, Italian, and Spanish, and possessed a sharp wit that could disarm anyone. In the year 1968, she was receiving thousands of fan letters a week from all corners of the globe. She was poised to become the next Grace Kelly, a star who could bridge the gap between European art house cinema and the glitz of Hollywood blockbusters. The world was watching her, waiting for her to take the throne as the queen of the silver screen. However, the film industry of the 1970s was not interested in an intelligent woman who could speak multiple languages. The producers and studio executives of that era saw her as a trophy, a living doll to be placed in scenes to make the male lead look good. As she tried to transition from television stardom to a serious film career, she hit a wall of misogyny that was as solid as concrete. Alexandra was frequently subjected to the infamous casting couch culture. She spoke in later years about being summoned to private meetings in hotel rooms under the guise of discussing scripts, only to find a producer expecting something very different from a reading. Unlike many who felt forced to comply to save their careers, Alexandra had a backbone of steel. She refused these indecent proposals with a polite but firm no, walking out of rooms and leaving powerful men with bruised egos. This refusal to play the game came with a severe price tag. In the 1970s, word traveled fast among the elite boys' club of British cinema. If a woman was labeled as cold or uncooperative, the scripts simply stopped arriving. Alexandra found herself being passed over for the complex, leading roles she craved. Instead, she was offered parts that required her to be little more than window dressing in B-movies or horror films. The industry tried to force her into a box, pushing her to pose for risque magazines to maintain her profile, something she found demeaning and irrelevant to her craft. She wanted to act. They wanted her to be a pin-up. The frustration of being valued solely for her appearance while her mind was ignored began to erode her passion for the business. She saw her contemporaries, those who had perhaps compromised, climbing the ladder while she was left on the rung of cult stardom. By the late 1970s, Alexandra Bastedo made a life-altering decision. She realized that the industry was never going to give her the respect she deserved. Rather than fighting a losing battle against a system rigged against virtuous women, she chose to disappear from the limelight. She retreated to the English countryside and founded an animal sanctuary, dedicating the rest of her life to the care of horses, donkeys, and cats. It was a noble calling, but it was also a loss for cinema. She traded the red carpets and the toxic environment of the studios for the mud and hard work of the farm, finding a peace there that fame could never offer. Her story is a powerful example of the silent boycott. There was no big scandal, no public explosion, just a gradual closing of doors because she refused to barter her dignity for a role. Alexandra Bastedo proved that she was stronger than the industry that tried to exploit her. She died in the year 2014, celebrated not just as the star of the champions, but as a woman of immense integrity who walked away from the hollow promises of fame to live a life of real meaning. Yet, one cannot help but mourn the films she never made, the performances we never saw, simply because she refused to say yes to the wrong men. Imogen Hassel. If there is one name that serves as the ultimate cautionary tale of the British film industry in the 1970s, it is Imogen Hassel. Born into a creative and wealthy family, she was named after a Shakespearean princess, a clear sign of the artistic destiny her parents envisioned for her. She was not just a beauty, she was a student of the prestigious London Academy of Music and Dramatic Art. Imogen entered the Royal Shakespeare Company with dreams of playing Ophelia or Juliet, armed with talent and a burning ambition to be taken seriously on the stage. However, the cinema industry of the late 60s and 70s had no interest in her classical training. The moment she stepped in front of a camera, the directors and producers saw only one thing: her stunning physical form. She was quickly dubbed the Countess of Cleavage by a ruthless tabloid press, a nickname she absolutely despised but could never shake off. It was a label that devalued her entire existence, reducing a complex, intelligent woman to a mere punchline for the male gaze. Throughout the 1970s, Imogen was cast repeatedly in roles that required her to be decorative and silent. She appeared in Hammer horror films and carry-on movies, productions that were famous for their exploitation of young women. Behind the scenes, the pressure was suffocating. Imogen was constantly battling with directors who wanted her to reveal more, to wear less, and to smile while they stripped away her dignity. She was paraded at premieres as arm candy for studio executives, forced to play the part of the dumb blonde when, in reality, she was articulate and sensitive. The industry treated her as a public utility, a pin-up girl whose only function was to sell tickets to men. When she tried to refuse these roles or demanded scripts with actual dialogue, she was met with cold indifference. The producers told her she should be grateful, that this was the only way a woman like her could have a career. The tragedy of Imogen Hassel was her desperate, years-long fight to break the mold that the industry had cast her in. She traveled to Hollywood in the mid-70s, hoping that the Americans might see the actress underneath the image, but the reputation crafted by the British press followed her across the Atlantic. The casting directors there saw the same thing the British ones did: a body, not a person. The constant rejection of her talent, combined with the aggressive pursuit of her physical self, began to erode her spirit. She was surrounded by an industry that viewed her refusal to play the casting couch game not as integrity, but as a lack of cooperation. She was isolated, lonely, and deeply misunderstood. The public saw a glamorous party girl living the high life. The reality was a woman crying out for professional respect that was systematically denied to her. By the end of the 1970s, Imogen's career had stalled completely. The phone stopped ringing. The directors who had made millions off her image in the early part of the decade had moved on to the next fresh face, leaving her behind like a discarded prop. The psychological toll of this abandonment was catastrophic. She had given everything to an industry that took her youth and her privacy and gave her nothing back but a humiliating nickname. Her personal life began to unravel under the weight of her broken professional dreams. She formed relationships that fell apart, further fueling the tabloid fire, while the serious acting work she craved remained forever out of reach. In the year 1980, at the heartbreakingly young age of 38, Imogen Hassel left this world. Her passing was the final, tragic act of a life that had been ground down by the machinery of show business. She was found in her home, a victim of a system that had no safety net for the stars it created and destroyed. Today, we remember her not as the caricature the directors made her, but as a talented artist who was never given the chance to fly. Her story is a dark stain on the history of British cinema, a permanent reminder of how the industry's obsession with image over humanity can have fatal consequences. She was a woman who wanted to be heard, but the world only wanted to look at her, and that silence eventually became too heavy to bear. Madeline Smith. When we speak of the quintessential English rose of the 1970s, the image that immediately springs to mind for millions of cinemagoers is that of Madeline Smith. With her auburn hair, porcelain skin, and a soft, innocent voice, she was the personification of a specific kind of British beauty. She burst onto the scene as a model, but the film industry quickly snatched her up, sensing a star who could sell tickets simply by appearing on the poster. Her defining moment came in the year 1973, when she played the beautiful Miss Caruso in the James Bond film Live and Let Die. It was the role of a lifetime, sharing the screen with Roger Moore in his debut as the secret agent. That iconic scene, where her blue dress is unzipped by a magnetic watch, is etched into pop culture history. At that moment, Madeline Smith was arguably one of the most famous faces in the United Kingdom, a woman who seemed destined for a long and glittering career in Hollywood. However, the reality of her daily life in the film business was far removed from the glamour of the Bond set. Madeline was a victim of the Hammer horror machine, a production line that churned out gothic fantasies where women were almost exclusively used as decoration. While she gained fame in films like The Vampire Lovers, she was constantly battling against a humiliating typecasting. The industry was obsessed not with her acting ability, which was considerable, particularly her gift for comedy, but with her physical measurements. Casting directors in the 1970s were often brutal and dehumanizing. Madeline has recalled instances where she would walk into an audition room and the men behind the desk would not ask her to read a single line of dialogue. Instead, they would discuss her anatomy as if she were a piece of furniture, deciding her fate based entirely on whether she fit the visual fantasy they were selling that week. The destruction of her potential career came from her refusal to simply accept this treatment as the norm. As the 1970s progressed, the demands from producers became more extreme. The era of the soft comedy and the horror film was becoming sleazier, and the pressure on actresses to perform in scenes that were gratuitous and exploitative was immense. Madeline was not a woman who was willing to sell her soul for screen time. She was uncomfortable with the increasing nudity and the way the camera lingered on her, ignoring her face to focus on her body. When she attempted to push back, to ask for roles that allowed her to keep her clothes on and use her comedic timing, the industry turned its back on her. The directors who had been so eager to cast her suddenly found her uncooperative. In the boys' club of the 70s film industry, a woman who had boundaries was a woman who did not work. By the late 1970s, the silence was deafening. The scripts that had once flooded her mailbox dwindled to nothing. The industry was shifting towards a grittier realism, and because Madeline had been so aggressively branded as a Hammer glamour girl, the new wave of serious directors refused to take her seriously. She was trapped in the image the men had created for her. She had played the game by their rules early on, thinking it was the stepping stone to better things, only to realize that for women like her, there was no next step. The casting couch culture meant that unless she was willing to attach herself to a powerful producer or endure the private auditions that were common knowledge in Soho, she was out in the cold. Madeline Smith's disappearance from mainstream cinema is a genuine loss to the British arts. She possessed a warmth and a natural charm that could have seen her transition into a beloved television actress or a comedy legend. Instead, she was discarded the moment the trends changed. She eventually found happiness away from the spotlight, marrying and raising a family. But her filmography stops abruptly, a jagged line that marks the end of her patience with a misogynistic system. She was a star who was destroyed not by a lack of talent, but by an industry that could only see a woman as an object and had no use for her once she demanded to be treated as a human being. Her legacy is one of survival, a woman who walked away with her dignity intact when the price of fame became too high to pay. Veronica Carlson. In the pantheon of British horror cinema, Veronica Carlson holds a unique and somewhat tragic place. With her cascade of golden blonde hair and a face that radiated pure innocence, she was handpicked by the legendary Jimmy Sangster to be the ultimate damsel in distress. In the year 1968, she starred in Dracula Has Risen from the Grave, a film that became one of the most commercially successful productions in the history of Hammer Studios. To the public, she was the epitome of the glamorous movie star, appearing opposite icons like Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing. She possessed a natural elegance, a refined quality that set her apart from the more overt pin-up girls of the era. Critics noted that she brought a genuine acting ability to roles that were usually two-dimensional, giving the horror genre a touch of class that it desperately needed. It seemed that Veronica was destined to transition from the gothic castles of Bray Studios to the drawing rooms of high-budget period dramas or major romantic leads. However, the film industry of the 1970s was undergoing a crude and rapid transformation, one that had no place for Veronica's brand of dignified beauty. As the decade began, the censorship laws in the United Kingdom were relaxing, and producers interpreted this as a license to fill their films with gratuitous content. The gothic romance was replaced by sleaze. Veronica found herself in a constant battle with directors who were less interested in her ability to convey fear or love and entirely obsessed with how much clothing she could be persuaded to remove. The atmosphere on the sets changed from one of creative filmmaking to something far more predatory. She was frequently asked to perform in scenes that felt exploitative and cheap, scenes that added nothing to the story but were designed solely to titillate a male audience. The breaking point for Veronica was not a sudden explosion, but a gradual, grinding pressure that eroded her love for the art form. She was a trained artist and a painter, a woman of deep sensitivity who viewed acting as a craft. The directors of the mid-70s, however, viewed her simply as a body to be displayed. When she refused to participate in the new wave of highly explicit horror films that were becoming popular, the industry's attitude towards her turned icy. The scripts that were sent to her agent became increasingly insulting. She was being offered roles that required her to be little more than a victim in compromising situations, devoid of any dialogue or character arc. The powerful men who ran the studios made it clear: if she wanted to remain a leading lady, she had to shed her inhibitions and her clothes. Veronica Carlson chose dignity over stardom. In a move that shocked her fans, she essentially walked away from the British film industry while she was still in her prime. She refused to lower her standards to meet the demands of a depraved market. She packed her bags and moved to the United States, turning her back on the bright lights of London to focus on her painting and her family. It was a self-imposed exile, driven by the realization that the industry she had entered no longer existed. The producers who had once courted her now dismissed her as old-fashioned because she would not demean herself for a paycheck. Her departure left a void in British cinema that was never quite filled. Veronica Carlson represented a lost era of glamour and restraint. By refusing to play the game of the 1970s casting couch and rejecting the demands for sleaze, she preserved her self-respect but sacrificed a career that could have been legendary. Today, she is remembered with immense fondness by fans who recognize that her disappearance was a result of her integrity. She was a woman who said no to the exploitation machine, proving that some things are more valuable than a name on a movie poster. The industry destroyed her career by refusing to accommodate a woman who demanded to be treated with respect, but they could not destroy her spirit. Vanessa Howard. In the annals of British cult cinema, there is perhaps no ghost more elusive or more tragic than Vanessa Howard. During the late 1960s, she was the absolute embodiment of the swinging London spirit. With her wide, innocent eyes, flowing blonde hair, and a screen presence that vibrated with youthful energy, she was the darling of the new wave. She starred in films that are now considered classics of the era, such as the psychological thriller Corruption and the bizarrely brilliant Mumsy, Nanny, Sunny, and Girly. By the year 1970, Vanessa Howard was on the precipice of true superstardom. She was working alongside screen legends like Peter Cushing, and the film magazines predicted that she would be the face of the new decade. She had that rare quality that cameras adore, a mixture of fragility and hidden strength that made the audience want to protect her. However, as the calendar turned to the 1970s, the British film industry began to curdle into something far more cynical. The era of the harmless romp was over, replaced by a ruthless drive for exploitation. Vanessa found herself trapped in a system that had no interest in nurturing her dramatic talents. To the producers and directors of Soho, she was a commodity to be used up and discarded. The roles that were offered to her became increasingly sordid. She was no longer asked to play characters with depth. She was asked to play victims, to scream, and to shed her clothing for the gratification of a male audience. The innocence that had been her trademark was now being weaponized against her. The industry did not want her to grow up into a serious woman. They wanted to freeze her as a perpetual child victim, a trope that was disturbing even by the lax standards of the time. Behind the velvet ropes of the VIP parties and the closed doors of the production offices, the pressure on Vanessa was immense. It was an open secret that in the 1970s, the route to the best scripts often involved navigating the unwanted advances of powerful older men. Vanessa was a professional who took her craft seriously, but she was surrounded by a culture that viewed acting as secondary to availability. When she refused to engage in the sleazy games of the casting couch, or when she pushed back against scenes that she felt were exploitative and unnecessary, the atmosphere around her shifted. She was labeled as uncooperative. The invitations to the high-profile premieres began to dry up. The directors who had once praised her natural ability now claimed she was difficult to work with, simply because she had boundaries that she refused to let them cross. The end of her career came with a shocking suddenness that still baffles historians today. In the year 1974, at the incredibly young age of 26, Vanessa Howard simply stopped. She walked away from the film set and never looked back. There was no farewell tour, no transition into television soap operas, and no public meltdown. She chose total and absolute silence. It was a decision born of deep disillusionment. She had seen the ugly underbelly of the dream factory, and she realized that the price of remaining a star was her own soul. The industry had made it clear that there was no place for her unless she was willing to become exactly what they wanted, a silent object of desire. Rather than compromise her integrity, she chose to vanish. For decades, fans wondered what had happened to the golden girl of British horror. Rumors swirled that she had moved to America or that she had fallen into destitute circumstances. The truth was far more dignified but equally sad in the context of cinema history. She lived a quiet life, far removed from the cameras, protecting her privacy fiercely until she passed away in the year 2010. Her disappearance is a damning indictment of the 1970s film business. Here was a woman of immense potential, a star who lit up the screen, who was effectively bullied out of her profession by a system that valued exploitation over talent. Vanessa Howard's filmography remains a frozen moment in time, a testament to what could have been if the industry had known how to treat a woman with respect. She stands as the ultimate symbol of the lost generation of actresses who refused to be broken. Jutta Stensgaard. If there is one story that perfectly encapsulates the disposable nature of women in the British film industry of the 1970s, it is the vanishing act of Jutta Stensgaard. Although born in Denmark, she moved to the United Kingdom as a teenager and became the face of a very specific moment in British pop culture. By the late 1960s, she was a familiar face on television, appearing in popular series like The Saint and The Avengers. She possessed an ethereal, almost otherworldly beauty, pale skin, piercing eyes, and a quiet intensity that set her apart from the loud, brassy starlets of the day. In the year 1971, she landed the role that should have made her a global superstar, the lead in the Hammer horror film Lust for a Vampire. It was the chance every young actress in London was fighting for, a leading role in a major production that promised to launch her into the stratosphere. However, the dream quickly turned into a nightmare. The production of Lust for a Vampire is now legendary for all the wrong reasons. It represented the moment when the classic British horror film descended into pure exploitation. Jutta had signed on believing she was making a gothic romance, a film with artistic merit. Instead, she found herself on a set that was chaotic and deeply disrespectful. The directors and producers were not interested in her acting range. They were interested in how much skin she would show. The script was rewritten on the fly to include more gratuitous scenes, and the atmosphere was thick with a predatory energy. Jutta was treated not as the star of the film, but as a prop to be manipulated. She was expected to perform in scenes that made her deeply uncomfortable, with the constant threat that if she complained, she would be replaced and blacklisted. The experience of making that film broke her spirit. She saw the true face of the 1970s film industry, a machine that chewed up young women and spat them out without a second thought. The reviews for the film were harsh, often focusing on her physical appearance rather than her performance, further cementing her feeling that she was not being taken seriously as an artist. She realized that as long as she stayed in the British film industry, she would never be offered the roles she craved, roles with dignity, intelligence, and depth. She was trapped in a pigeonhole of the foreign temptress, a role that required her to be silent and seductive while the men around her made the decisions. The casting couch culture was rampant, and Jutta was not willing to trade her self-respect for another B-movie role. In a move that was as sudden as it was absolute, Jutta Stensgaard disappeared. She did not just leave the film industry, she left the country and the life she had known. She moved to the United States and completely reinvented herself, turning her back on the fame that so many others would have killed for. She refused interviews for decades, wanting nothing to do with the industry that had tried to exploit her. She eventually found peace in a completely different world, working in radio and embracing a spiritual life that was a million miles away from the smoke-filled studios of Soho. Her disappearance was so complete that for a long time, fans and historians did not even know if she was still alive. Jutta Stensgaard's story is the ultimate mic drop on the British film industry of the 1970s. She was a woman who looked the beast in the eye and walked away. She proved that her dignity was not for sale, regardless of the price. While we are left to wonder what kind of career she might have had if the industry had been different, her legacy is one of strength. She is the star who said no, the actress who realized that the cost of being a sex symbol was too high, and who chose the quiet anonymity of a normal life over the noisy, degrading machine of show business. She remains an enigma, a beautiful ghost who haunts the frames of a few cult films, reminding us of the talent that was driven away by the greed and misogyny of the era.